So tonight, the rise of Antifa, which is how it's pronounced. I know this because I saw Mark Bray a lot on television back in August after Charlottesville, and it's Antifa. You know, this is a swelling movement, a reaction to fascism. It's very confusing and very troubling what's happening these days. Where does liberalism end? Where does anti-fascism begin? These are some of the questions that I think we'll get some insights on tonight. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker and our moderator. Mark Bray is a political organizer and historian of human rights, terrorism, and political radicalism in modern Europe. He earned his BA in philosophy from Wesleyan University and his PhD in history from Rutgers University. He is the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, Translating Anarchy, the Anarchism of Occupy Wall Street, and two forthcoming works, The Anarchist Inquisition, Terrorism and Human Rights in Spain and France, 1890 to 1910, and Anarchist Education and the Modern School, of Francisco Ferrar Reader, for which he is the co-editor. His work has appeared in Foreign Policy, Critical Quarterly, Roar Magazine, and numerous edited volumes. He is currently a lecturer at Dartmouth College. Tonight, Mark will be in conversation with Alex Shephard. Thank you, Alex. Alex is a staff writer at the New Republic. So please help me welcome Alex and Mark.
Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I thought that we could just start by helpfully defining our terms.
Yeah, that's really a good place to start.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what is Antifa?
Sure. So in some ways, it's really simple. It's short for anti-fascist or anti-fascism. And if you get that far, that's really good, and that's one step farther than many people have gotten. But there's more to it than that, right? So there have been different perspectives and different histories of resisting fascism over the past century. Antifa refers to a specific tendency which in English and Italian is often called militant anti-fascism, in German is often called autonomous anti-fascism, and in French is often called radical anti-fascism. And this tendency really crystallized as a distinct position after World War II around two related concepts. The first is that it's a pan-radical left politics of social revolutionary self-defense against the far right. All sorts of different leftists and Marxists and anarchists and socialists getting together on the same page to resisting a common enemy, in large part because before World War II, the left in Europe was really bad at that for the most part. The other consideration is that it's a direct action response to fascism. In the post-war period, there were plenty of socialist and communist parties who argued that the way that you stop the far right is to make them illegal. Antifa said, we can't trust the state, we can't trust the police, we need to organize in our communities to stop the far right. So it's one specific tendency that has existed for 100 years, but was really sort of clearly defined in the post-war period. There are other folks, other traditions resisting fascism. There's different ways to resist fascism. This is one tendency, so I hope that's a good starter.
So particularly over the last 6 or 7 months, in the mainstream media, Antifa has been reduced typically to two things, which are no platforming and the black bloc. At the same time, it's often presented either as a pure negation of fascism or in some cases a kind of anarchistic equivalent. But what do we lose with these kinds of simplifications?
Sure. So the issue of no platform for fascism, I think, is interesting and a place to start. The slogan, no platform for fascism, I believe really got going in anti-fascist circles around the 1970s in Britain. And a lot of journalists I've spoken to believe that no platform implies a certain strategic or tactical outlook. Like no platform means you physically shut down someone who's speaking. Sometimes that's what it looks like, but a lot of times it doesn't, and it doesn't have to, right? No platform for fascism is a rejection of the notion that fascist politics are just differences of opinion that can be politely disagreed with and won't be harmful, right? So when we try to pressure a venue that's hosting a neo-Nazi punk show to, hey, you shouldn't host them, and if you do, we're going to boycott you. That's no platform politics in practice. And so it's important, I think, to understand in this whole conversation that despite the media focus on black bloc, on confrontation, on a certain look, there are a myriad of ways of preventing fascism and white supremacy from taking root where we live and where we do our work. So there's been this focus on black bloc, on masks, and when I've spoken to journalists, part of what I've tried to do is encourage them to look at other different ways, other different looks for resisting fascism, because there are many ways of doing it. And when I've pointed them towards groups doing it through the union movement, or doing it through community organizing, or linking anti-police brutality work or anti-gentrification work with anti-fascist work, the response is, well, do they wear masks? And I'm like, no, they do. Okay, well, thank you very much. Hang up, right? So there is that way in which, to some extent, the specific image that the media has capitalized upon has made the issue something people have talked about, but also forestalled popular presentations of what it can look like.
So in your book, you write, anti-fascism is many things, but perhaps most fundamentally, it is an argument about the historical continuity between different eras of far-right violence and the many forms of collective self-defense that it has necessitated across the globe. I think that that's one of the book's most important insights. But I was wondering why you think it's taken hold, I think, in the United States, this idea that, fascism is something that happens other places, it happens in other times.
Yeah, so what I was getting at with that line is anti-fascism as a framework for politics, to me, only really makes sense if you think there's something in common between the far right today and the far right 100 years ago, and something in common between resisting that far right today and resisting it 100 years ago. So I did a presentation once where there was a historian who had the opposite opinion, who argued that there is absolutely nothing in common between either the far right of the past and today or the resistance to it of the past or to today. I'll leave it up to you to make up your minds, but I'm very strongly of the opinion that there are things in common. There are differences as well, right? So when we talk about what anti-fascism looks like today, or over the last few decades, culturally, it looks different than it did in the 1920s, with strong connections to music scenes, punk clubs, online culture. There's all sorts of differences. But I think it's important to understand the connections with what the far right looks like, and that if we are truly serious about never again, we need to be vigilant and active about never again, and not let these kinds of politics take even the first step in that direction. What else did you ask again?
I asked a bunch of things in that question, but I was wondering if you could first expound maybe on some of the similarities between Antifa now and the sort of origins of these movements that you write about.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, to start as far back, I guess you could start really far back, but to start farther back than usual, I was interested in my research in looking at resistance to the growth of anti-Semitism in France in the 1890s. So some of you have probably heard of the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair was a case in the 1890s in France when a Jewish captain in the military was accused of treason. He was actually innocent, these charges were wrong, but this gave the growing far right, a far right that historians have pointed to as one of the most clearest examples of a kind of proto-fascist movement in Europe, an excuse to promote anti-Semitic politics throughout society and attack Jews, attack the left, and so forth. So the kind of left militant response to this took its clearest form in a group called the Revolutionary Coalition that did a number of things that to me sound very reminiscent of what anti-fascists do today. When they'd see anti-Semitic posters up around Paris, they'd tear them down and put up their own posters against anti-Semitism for, universal humanity and so forth. When people would show up to the court to testify on behalf of Dreyfus to say he was innocent, they would provide security and prevent the anti-Semites from attacking them. When anti-Semites would have an event at a local restaurant, these pro-Dreyfusard revolutionaries would forge fake tickets to try to gain entrance into the event. When they couldn't get in, they'd smash through the doors and disrupt it. So in this way, this is sort of a proto-fascism and a proto-anti-fascism that in its kind of literal tactical outlook and its perspective about not conceding the far right any ground, not considering what they have to say to just be sort of a cute little difference of opinion, but an imminent threat, you can see the similarities. And moreover, if you look at like the 20s and 30s in Britain, for example, whose anti-fascist resistance, both in the 20s and 30s and in the 70s and 80s, is perhaps one of the best kind of parallels to what we see here. The left would show up to fascist events and try to shut them down forcibly if necessary. And there was no debate within the left of Britain or France in the 20s and 30s as to whether or not we should just sort of sit back and listen to what these people have to say. Increasingly, especially at the kind of rank and file level, the European left was starting to realize what they should have realized from the beginning, which is if we don't act now, it could be too late. So a lot of the tactical strategic methods and outlooks are reminiscent. I think what has changed over time is the cultural form that it takes and the ways in which both fascism and anti-fascism have tried to pivot to appeal to people on different kinds of grounds.
Yeah, so I mean, in the U.S. media in particular, we tend to act as if Antifa, emerged out of the soil in Charlottesville 6 months ago or whatever. One of the things that really stood out to me in the book was that you make an argument that the roots of anti-fascist organizing in America were actually during Reconstruction, and I thought that was a very compelling and unique insight, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, the first thing to kind of clarify is that the framework of anti-fascism, I think, should not necessarily be imposed on all forms of resistance to white supremacy in different times and places, but rather, I think it's useful to kind of provincialize or minimize the anti-fascist lens and recognize what Aimé Césaire and Du Bois and other writers argued, which is fascism can be understood as European imperialism, genocide, and white supremacy brought home to the European continent. And in that way, you can trace this broader trajectory of resisting these kinds of genocidal forces back to 1492, back to the transatlantic slave trade, back to really the destructive legacy of Europe around the globe. So in that sense, I think it's useful to see fascism and anti-fascism as terms used to describe one facet of this struggle originally in Europe. There have been movements, decolonial movements, anti-racist movements across the world throughout different eras of the 20th century that use the language of anti-fascism, but there have been plenty of others that didn't. And so I think it's important not to necessarily privilege groups that use one sort of certain language or came out of one certain tradition. In terms of the context of the U.S., I was doing a presentation in Berkeley, and someone asked an interesting question about could slavery be considered a kind of fascism? Which I thought that was an interesting question, and I thought about it for a moment, and my response is that there's something inherent in fascism that is a desire for a return to an imagined past. And so I think during the era of slavery in the United States, for the most part, white supremacist slaveholders had things pretty much how they wanted them to be. But after the end of slavery, the Klan and other kinds of reactionary white supremacist forces, of course, tried to bring back what they imagined as this ideal past. So in terms of American history, you could start to talk about it just as the historian Robert Paxton has argued that the KKK could be seen functionally as sort of the first proto-fascist group. That desire for a return to reinstill these imagined values, not to say that, well, we can talk about what it means for values to be imagined another time, but that this and resistance to it could be seen as sort of the initial kind of fascist, anti-fascist conflict if you think of it in terms of this question of white supremacy and a return to it, which is not to say, of course, that white supremacy ended with slavery, but certainly this perspective of an ideal return, I think, can be characteristic of that period.
Along those lines, I mean, I think one characteristic that has stood out to me in media coverage of Antifa over the last few months has been, and of just coverage of the Trump administration in general, is this failure to contextualize things. And you see it in minor issues like forgetting that the last 4 presidents issued steel tariffs or whatever, but then you also see it in major issues like the character and behavior of the president himself. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about why maintaining that kind of historical continuity with regard to fascism is so difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, to some extent, and I'm sure you and many in the audience are well aware, it's difficult to situate anything historically in this country. So you mentioned that the news portrayed anti-fascism as if it were a new idea that had just been proposed a few months ago. The same was true with Occupy Wall Street. All of the different tendencies of organizing in the anti-nuclear movement and feminist movements and global justice movements and you name it that led up to the methods and outlooks of Occupy Wall Street. Many of the people who were involved with Occupy Wall Street were well versed in this, would tell journalists about this, but to sell it in their coverage, they had to make it entirely new. And in the same way that happens here, why it happens that has deeper roots that could be a presentation all unto itself. But in terms of fascism, I think it's important on the one hand in a global context to point out that when the Axis power is lost in 45, it's not as if all the people who made those regimes happen or that sympathized with them or that were inspired with them suddenly changed their mind. They still existed, and there are plenty of political parties in Europe today whose lineage can be traced directly to these fascist groups, whether the Front National in France or many of these other ones. In the US, the history should be even more self-evident. You know, the lineage of white supremacy, of Jim Crow, of the KKK, of you name it, continues. And so resistance to that in all its different forms, whether called anti-fascism or not, and the Black Panthers did talk in terms of anti-fascism, for example, should be really self-evident, and this shouldn't be a discussion of kind of a new issue. Even with anti-racist action, which was the form that this kind of European-inspired militant anti-fascism took in the US in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and there are still groups today that use that name, that was not something small. There were thousands of people involved in hundreds of groups across the country that had a major influence on developing a kind of youth anti-racist culture. A simple Google search would tell a lot of these journalists that, but there's this desire to portray it as new, which is, I guess, part of the industry.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've thought about with this is, I mean, in journalism, particularly mainstream journalism, there's a sense that calling somebody a fascist or comparing them to Hitler is always beyond the pale. And I think that that's partly because, you know, as reporters, you encounter people, even people with horrific views, and you discover, you know, that they love their dog or have many other redeeming qualities. But one of the things that's interesting, and I think is a shift in coverage, is this idea that many Antifa groups have, which is that, you know, you're defined by your actions in these cases and your thoughts, and that, you know, even if you have other redeeming qualities, that participating in activities that are fascistic, you know, deserves repercussions.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose some folks here might think to that New York Times article, right? The kind of sympathetic portrayal of the neo-Nazi, focusing on how he liked Seinfeld and, you know, all sorts of mundane details to humanize this person. And it's sometimes strange to see how, I mean, obviously fascists are people, but that's not the point. But just not the point. But that there's this effort to try and take like the other side of the issue in an effort to present what is, I guess, imagined as a kind of impartiality or neutrality. But at the same time, folks on the left who do really mundane things are portrayed as demons, you know. So it's pretty transparent as far as I can tell. But yeah, that's a thing. But you're right though that like calling people fascist, calling people Hitler, comparing them to Hitler, sure that can be overdone. But you know, I wish CNN or whoever was actually invested, why not bring on Robert Paxton or like one of the leading voices on fascism and have what they have to say? You know, so fascism is a thing. We can assess whether someone's perspectives are similar to or different from it. And we can look at the ways that, I mean, what I learned writing this book is there's relatively little written about post-war anti-fascism, but there's a ton written about the post-war far right. So it's not really a mystery, but nevertheless, I mean, you're the journalist. You can probably answer this question, but nevertheless, it's not really done as much as it ought to.
Well, I think part of it is also that, and you see this broadly speaking, both in the media and in the, you know, quote unquote resistance, is this faith that liberal democracy alone, right, will be sufficient to overcome this. And there are some pretty twisted variants of it where there's a kind of, Green Lantern theory that Bob Mueller will, shiv the president or something. But I think, what these groups would argue, and what I think your book does a fairly conclusive job of showing, is that, fascism's roots often come via democratic means.
Yeah, the broader issue is there's a real question in parliamentary politics of whether all problems can be solved by electing politicians who will fix them. And there's a range of perspectives on that. There are people who think that basically protest politics are irrelevant, or at best they provide kind of a live action opinion poll for people in power to assess what we all, the little people, think, and then put that into action. There's a range of perspectives on that, but the notion that we may need to do it ourselves when it comes to defending ourselves against fascism is probably one of the more controversial manifestations of direct action. But I think in a certain way we can think through it to really understand the necessity of direct action politics, broadly speaking. That if we look at the fact that Hitler and Mussolini came to power largely legally, they didn't storm down the gates of power, the elites of German and Italian society welcomed them in. We can talk why that is later. And really the notion that especially after Black Lives Matter put the epidemic of police murders of Black people on the national platform. Shortly after, all of a sudden, the same people who were saying, well, we have an issue with the police, were saying, don't worry about white supremacists, we can trust the police. And there's a real disconnect, as if these issues have nothing to do with each other, but the white supremacist history of the police department, even the more recent examples of FBI investigations of white power infiltration into local law enforcement show that that's a real issue. And even if anyone was looking at any of the videos of Charlottesville and how the police were, one, not there, but two, when they were helping white supremacists clear pepper spray out of their eyes in a way that you would never see at a Black Lives Matter event, there's an issue. So the question is, do we need to do it ourselves? Well, can we afford not to be ready to do so? Because ultimately, if you look at the failure of the European left in the 20s and 30s to deal with Mussolini and Hitler, one of the problems was, among many, was that these political parties weren't ready for the fascist seizure of power and were essentially left flat-footed when the time came to shift to a new strategy of resistance.
Yeah, and one of the arguments that you would encounter, particularly in the transition, which now feels like it was decades ago, was that our institutions alone would be sufficient to kind of moderate behavior, that being president is very difficult, and there are all these constraints, and our system is very convoluted. And yet, I was thinking about that when I was reading the book, because those were the kinds of arguments that people were making in the 1930s in Germany as well. Sure.
So, I mean, if you look at the Enabling Act, which was the government provision which allowed Hitler to centralize his dictatorial authority, that was approved by the German Reichstag, under duress, admittedly. So the notion that authoritarianism and parliamentary democracy are inherently antithetical overlooks the fact that just about every parliamentary system has emergency provisions on the books for the centralization of power in times of real or perceived crisis. Shows you, I mean, recently Donald Trump said the only way to unite this country is through a major event or something along those lines. So, he wants a Reichstag fire. Right? I'm sorry if that's a reference that people don't get, but basically there was a fire to the German parliament that allowed Hitler to centralize authority. So if we had some sort of a crisis, which I really, really hope we don't, there would be people in government who would want to peel away all of the, what I would argue are relatively superficial trappings of democracy and centralize authority in the people's hands who could actually solve the problem. So that's like a kind of macro concern, but even it doesn't have to get that far, right? What I call an all or nothing perspective on fascism pervades how many Americans think of it. If you don't have a Hitler or a Hitler-ish person in office, don't sweat. everything's fine. Because it's either fascism, either we have swastikas hanging from the halls of power, or everything's fine. And there are a whole range of terrible situations in between, including the one that we have now, which is the fact that there are white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups killing people. And in my mind and in the mind of anti-fascist organizers, that is enough. Even if it doesn't get worse than that, we still need to be keeping an eye on these groups because any violence they do to anyone is too much.
So the common criticism of that line, right, is that these actions themselves are self-defeating, that they sully the name of those who are trying to organize in a broader sense, and that they, you're reducing yourself to the fascist level. And I mean, but as you argue in the book, these are very short-term focused arguments, right? And that the longer-term benefits of, say, refusing to let fascists speak end up benefiting people more than we would realize. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the critiques come, in my experience, on the sort of moral, ethical plane and on the question of efficacy. So starting for the moment on the question of efficacy, I think that's in many ways much more interesting. So there are these arguments, you should just ignore them. If you don't ignore them, this makes them stronger, it makes them grow. All right, these are arguments that can actually be assessed using historical and current events examples. Most recently, I wrote an article in Salon about 1 year since the protests against Milo Yiannopoulos at Berkeley, and Natasha Leonard wrote an article in The Intercept about the recent failures of the white supremacist Richard Spencer. And just to take those two examples as recent examples, it's pretty clear that both of their abilities to organize events, to get their message out in the public, to organize kind of broader public opinion have declined. Richard Spencer canceled his college speaking tour. He said, Antifa are too successful at stopping me. Every time he tries to have an event, it turns into a crisis. And that points to the larger question of how do fascist movements grow? We don't need to speculate, we don't need to imagine. We can look at the actual movements that have grown, that are growing around the world, and see that the way they grow is not entirely different from how left-wing movements grow. They need to embed themselves in communities. They need to meet people's needs. They need to provide answers to the things that people are concerned about. They need to gain access to the halls of power. Not mysterious. And so if you look at how they've grown historically, how they grow today, how groups in Italy like Casa Pound or in Greece like Golden Dawn give free food, but only to ethnic Italians or ethnic Greeks. That's also something going on in French Canada, and there's a group called Food Against Fascism, which is responding from the left by giving out sort of food not bomb style free food to anyone, regardless of who they are. If you can see how these movements grow and see that basically, if you want to stop them from growing, you make every aspect of movement building much more difficult than it would be normally. So if you've been part of a group and you've organized an event, you know that it can be a challenge. Making sure that people follow through on commitments, that you book a venue, that you advertise the event, who's going to print the flyers, who's going to hand them out, who's going to update the website. But if there is a group of people dedicated to stopping you from doing all those things, it makes it that much more difficult. It's a little bit common sense, and it's strange that people don't recognize it. And you can see in the case of Spencer, in the case of Yiannopoulos, in the case of, really, if you look at the history of anti-racist action, if you look at the case of post-war militant anti-fascism in Britain, in Germany, that stopping all of these movement-building opportunities actually can stop movements from building. So I think that question of efficacy can be assessed, and I haven't come across a really well thought out critique from the other side that takes these actual examples into account from a macro perspective. More often it's made in the abstract as if there has never been a well-organized, concerted movement to stop the far right, which couldn't be farther from the truth. The moral questions, does this make you a fascist? I have gotten that question before. To me, to some extent, it's reflection of the fact that many Americans think that what it means to be a fascist or a Nazi is just that you're a really terrible person. I think if you want to get kind of historical about it, it grew out of a post-war tendency of Americans to say that what was wrong with Nazi Germany was individual evil, individual moral failings, individuals following orders, individuals being prejudicial against Jews or whoever. If you think of it as a political system, not necessarily exclusively as an individual moral failing, then I think it shifts the lens. But what we have is a culture where to be a Nazi means you're a jerk. You're a soup Nazi in the Seinfeld rendition, or you're a grammar Nazi or a feminazi. And so, therefore, anyone who shuts down someone else is guilty of that individual personal failing. And what that does is it obscures the politics. You can't just reduce one action to the entirety of the politics. You take any issue and you look at what anti-fascists argue, what fascists argue, ultranationalism, internationalism, patriarchy, feminism. They're night and day perspectives. And so to reduce it to simply shutting down the opposition is essentially normalizing liberal politics and saying any political perspective outside of the center is equivalent. So sure, fascists are illiberal. They don't subscribe to a liberal view. Militant anti-fascists are also illiberal. They do not subscribe to a liberal view. But that is essentially sort of the variation on the notion of extremism, that anything that's outside of the center is ultimately the same. ISIS and anarchists and communists and fascists are all the same, which is, just doesn't make any sense.
So another variant on that is that these groups extend these criticisms too far. And here I think the case of Charles Murray is probably illustrative, whose work was normalized by the publication for which I work and some others, but who has come, under harsh criticism while talking to college campuses. Mm-hmm. And one of, Murray has made all kinds of outrageous arguments, including that, there are scientific bases for IQ based on race. And yet, when he was shut down at Middlebury College, the sort of liberal establishment kind of rallied to his defense. Mm-hmm. PEN America released a statement criticizing these students. Mm-hmm. Now, these criticisms were mostly made in a kind of generational way.
Which is not something to ignore in this, I think. But,
yeah. But I thought it was very interesting where, in this case, Murray was deemed the sort of defensible person, and Antifa in this case, or the people who were shouting him down, were indefensible.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of, I was being interviewed on the New Yorker radio hour by David Remnick, and he said, okay, make a list of people that should be no platforms.
It's a good question.
Now, of course, obviously the game is I make a list. He says, well, what about someone who is slightly less egregious than that list? And then there's a reductio ad absurdum, and therefore I lose, right? So I did not go down that list, and I think the point is not to come up with a specific line beyond which one will not go, but rather to recognize that politics is a constantly evolving contestation over public values and how they are enacted. That is what it is, regardless of whether we want to say it or not. And so there's all sorts of words, there's all sorts of gestures, there's all sorts of behaviors that we as a society, both in terms of our legislation and in terms of our common interactions, have deemed are appropriate and inappropriate. We could name off the top of our head dozens of them tonight. And so when it comes to who is going to be presenting their perspectives in the public sphere, that is also going to play out. It's not up to me or up to you or anyone individually to say this person should or shouldn't be allowed to speak. It's going to be the process of the historical sum total of all of our perspectives. And to some extent, I think this can be sort of projected onto other kinds of issues. So to go back to Occupy Wall Street, I was involved with the Zuccotti encampment, and journalists would ask me sometimes, what gives you all the right to occupy this park so other people can't use it? Right, and so the argument being that any time a group of people sort of quote unquote imposes itself on the public, it's usurping that kind of abstract neutrality. And I think that you can to some extent make that case with any kind of politics that deviates from purely electoral means of problem solving. If you block a street, if you occupy a park, if you shut down someone who's giving a speech, you're essentially, from the critic's perspective, taking upon yourself to arbitrate what the public is or is not. But what I'm saying is I think that's actually what politics is if it's actually to be meaningful. And so whether or not Charles Murray, well, I'm cool with shutting down Charles Murray, just to clarify, but whether or not we shut down Charles Murray or someone else is not necessarily like, let's all agree on this one universal standard that will exist in time and place, but rather to say that, you know what, maybe having a really robust anti-racist movement is really awesome, and that maybe that is the focus more so than what is really a handful of incidents of speakers being interrupted, because it's portrayed as an epidemic, but the number of times that this has happened is actually pretty minimal, and the number of individuals it's happened to we could probably name on probably about a dozen people. The real question about, of course, quote unquote censorship or the restriction of the range of views on campus has a lot to do, with like the Koch brothers funding what our education should look like. And for example, people who organize Palestine solidarity on campuses and the Zionist lobby basically clamping down upon that kind of politics actually affects many more people than what we're talking about here. But you can see where my politics come from.
Well, one other issue here as well, and you see this more directly when it happens on a college campus, is this idea that the public sphere is a place for the free exchange of ideas, and that if these people who are shouting just had a conversation with Charles Murray, then whoever had the best idea would win, right? And that idea also plays out in politics as well.
Right, and as I discuss in the book, this notion of the free market of ideas, raising the best ideas to the top and the worst ideas to the bottom, was sort of it grew out of Enlightenment notions of the inevitable conquest of quote unquote truth. And the kind of ironic thing from my vantage point is that these notions were always ridiculous from the beginning, but from a European intellectual history perspective were sort of definitively discredited by World War II and the Holocaust. So to bring these ideas up again in the context of arguing that if we simply let fascists organize a movement to kill us all, everyone will realize that's a bad idea and it'll fall apart. That notion was historically derailed by that actually happening. So that having been said, though, I don't want to give you the wrong impression. We do need to make arguments. People who are sympathetic to far-right movements are often sympathetic when there is no sufficient left alternative to meet their needs. When there is economic chaos, we need to push back against xenophobia, encourage people to organize with their coworkers and their neighbors, and that involves making political arguments. But no argument actually ever is effective or ineffective in the absence of relationships of power. Everyone comes to the political arguments they hear with a given set of assumptions and values, with a certain positionality in society, which is dictated along all sorts of lines of identity and class and race and gender and sexuality and so forth. So the anti-fascist argument is, one, you make these arguments, but two, you recognize that you're not always going to win everyone over with the truth. I mean, if you think about the presidential election, if you paid attention exclusively to sort of the mainstream media or to the kind of liberal intelligentsia where a lot of these ideas and arguments were hashed out between the arguments made for the Clinton and Trump presidencies, it seems to me that at the national level, the argument that despite its many, many, many flaws, the Clinton perspective was superior to the Trump perspective was won on the macro sphere. Nevertheless, it didn't work out that way. Right, and there's plenty of other examples where you can say, okay, clearly this argument rationally has superiority. That doesn't mean it's going to result that way, And so, if you want to make sure, you have to make sure.
One thing that's been interesting is, I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this interview and watching the millions of people march over the weekend, is just the extent to which organizing on a mass scale has changed in the last 18 months, even if our understanding of it remains somewhat shallow. I was wondering, this is, I guess, a two-part question, but first of all, how you interpret Trump's role in all of this sort of mass organizing, and then second, how it specifically has affected Antifa.
Sure. So You know, on the one hand, these politics and these groups are not new. They've existed for decades previously, but certainly the alt-right and those sympathetic to white supremacist and fascist and far-right ideas were emboldened by Trump's campaign and his victory. The rash of, as some groups call them, hate crimes that grew out of that victory is impossible to ignore. In writing my book, I did interviews with more than 60 anti-fascists from 17 different countries, and among the approximately 25 people that I spoke to in the US, a number of them were from groups that organized for the first time in 2015, 2016, or 2017, groups in Rochester, New York, in Sacramento, in Indiana, organized because they felt that this was an imminent threat. And that's what's also missed in a lot of this, is that in these social movements, most people rarely focus only on one issue. So the people that I spoke to were also union organizers, were also environmentalists, were also doing community work and so forth. And the great irony of the kind of center-left critique of Antifa is that many of these people making these critiques don't realize that many of the groups and movements they like are, in some cases, the same people doing different things. I spoke to an anti-fascist from Madrid who made the kind of interesting argument that, in my experience, has flabbergasted some liberals when I've recounted the story, which is to say, he said, I don't care if mainstream society hates Antifa as long as we're successful in stopping the fascists, because, he explained, I'm a union organizer. When I take my mask off, I organize in my community, I build a better world, and in that sense, they don't need to necessarily coexist. There's an assumption that all politics needs to win over everyone all the time to be effective, and that's not true. But so the point is that the Trump presidency certainly emboldened the far right. It certainly made a lot of leftists believe that organizing against the far right was necessary, and it meant that people shifted their priorities. So, for example, I met with some of the anti-fascist organizers who organized the Charlottesville, co-organized with other groups, the Charlottesville demonstration back in August, and they explained that they had, in some cases, been spending some time doing anti-fascist work, some time organizing against an oil pipeline construction over the past few years, and when one seemed more pressing, they'd do the one and the other. So anti-fascism as a century of resistance rises and falls in proportion to the threat of the far right, and with the threat of Trump and the alt-right, it's sort of taken on a more public presence and has numerically increased. Nevertheless, there's also this kind of far-right conspiracy theory that anyone who shows up to a left presentation today is Antifa. But of course, people that do this kind of work are few in number. To do it, you have to be fairly committed, which is not to say that you have to be in an Antifa group to be an anti-fascist, and that gets back to the earlier conversation. There are many ways to be an anti-fascist, but to do the kind of work that's required to monitor the far right, to practice a healthy amount of security culture, to make sure that neo-Nazis don't find out where you work and where your family lives, that's a big commitment that not everyone will take upon themselves. So the question, Trump important, was there something else?
I don't remember.
Yeah, we can move on.
I mean, along those lines, these, the far right, Antifa, numerically speaking, these are both small groups, right? But these arguments on both sides, right, rests on the implication that the actions of these small groups can reverberate in these much larger ways. And one thing, I think, in the media, we have accepted this idea that is true on the far right, that there's been this obsession, or a little bit.
It depends, right? Because there is that perspective. These people are a sideshow. Focus on the real enemy in power, et cetera, et cetera. So that's also an interesting angle of it. But
yeah, that's true. But I think it's more readily accepted that the alt-right is, is part of the Trump DNA. And that is not the case on the left. And I was wondering why you think that is, but then also I think why it's so important to pay attention to the actions of these groups that, maybe cumulatively number in the, tens or hundreds of thousands.
Right. Well, I mean, part of it has to do with the kind of centrist assessment of what is the problem and what is the solution. So to the degree that the far right are considered a problem, it's basically in two ways. One, in terms of them committing crimes, in which case the solution is the police. The other way is in terms of which they influence the halls of power, Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, and so forth. The solution there is Robert Mueller or fill-in candidate for 2020, right? So in that way, counter-protests are at best kind of articulations of values that are supposed to be put into practice by the state or politicians. Within that, there's also, of course, questions of whether direct action has any place in political struggle, which is always an ongoing struggle regardless of the context. And then also the question of direct action and struggle. Sorry, my phone started vibrating. My brain screwed up for a second there. Is the issue of, violence and nonviolence. So there's this media notion that all of what anti-fascist groups entails confrontation, when in fact it's actually a small percentage of what they do. But it is a percentage of what they do, and they don't apologize for it. It is a politics of self-defense, and in that way, the questions of what counts as violence, what counts as nonviolence, what is acceptable politically, have been fought on the American left for decades, and of course the kind of hegemonic position of nonviolence is strong, and that's part of it too.
Yeah, I mean, you read in the book about the ongoing moral debate about punching Nazis, and I think this factors into that as well, right?
Right, and so certainly with the punching of Richard Spencer back a little over a year ago, right, New York Times said, is it okay to punch a Nazi? The response was more positive than I would have thought, and the fact that punching Spencer became a meme, that they made fun of it on Saturday Night Live, it was put to all the different music in the background, suggested that there was a certain opening to that perspective. But even those that were sympathetic or willing to entertain the idea, I think even in their sympathy or even in entertaining it, were simultaneously kind of trivializing it as kind of blowing off some steam. And we're making an effort to sort of equate the entire history and strategy of anti-fascism to one specific act done without reference to why it was done or what it means. So that's an issue as well.
Well, it was cathartic. It was seen as being cathartic, right? But also as, because it was on the day of the inauguration, but I think also it became self-negating in that way, right?
Well, I mean, it depends.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I think that there is a way in which it was interpreted in an effort to trivialize it. And so in that way, like, Nazi punching became seen by some critics as a fad. I remember there was some scholar who said, look, the Nazis did not come to power because not enough of them were punched. No one's arguing that the Nazis would have been stopped if a few more people had been punched. That's just not what the politics are. But on the other hand, you can see a few tangible outcomes. That Richard Spencer in his videos did state that in the future he'd have to put more money and effort into hiring security if he wanted to make public appearances. That basically since then, I can't think of the last instance that he's just made an open on-the-street interview. I think that's, his days of doing that are done. And the fact that it's basically encouraged a lot of people to put a lot of thought into how they wanted to stop him from organizing events has, I think, contributed to the notion that now his ability to be a public intellectual is really severely restricted. That's not a joke, and that does really influence the growth of the alt-right. Spencer was the person who coined the term. For a while there, it seemed like he might be the person who could come closest to mainstreaming those ideas. The fact that now he's essentially has to go into hiding, he can't do interviews on the street, he cannot do public tours. While some liberals might find that reprehensible, if he actually got where he wanted to get with his politics, those concerns would be trivial. And to me, I think that the punching is part of that. Which is not to say that that's the only part of the politics, which is not to say that everyone needs to punch Nazis to be able to do something to make the world free from Nazis. But, you know, I applaud the person who did that.
Well, while punching Nazis hasn't, I guess for obvious reasons, taken hold on the other side, there is a certain give and take with tactics, at least, where the alt-right in particular has, I think, you know, cleverly over the last two, well, I say cleverly, but over the last 2 decades, adopted many tactics from the left and from Antifa in particular. I was wondering,
Which particular did you have in mind?
well, I was thinking about doxing in particular. And because I think that, particularly on some of the Reddit places that and this idea of doxing Antifa members has become a very, public and favorite method of many groups.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to take a step back, the history of the kind of post-war fascist right in Europe and North America and elsewhere has been a continuous effort to hide from the popular social stigma against Nazis, to promote white supremacist politics under new names, in new forms, with new arguments and new contexts. So, for example, Spencer was one of the figures who was foremost in trying to take arguments put forward by European identitarian movements or the French New Right to argue that just as different nations around the world in the decolonial context had the right to national self-determination and national liberation struggles, so too did white people as a nation in Europe, in North America, have the right to national liberation struggles. Use that kind of language and really try to, in some cases, infiltrate liberal language about freedom of speech, about equal rights. If you go back, for example, to British fascists in the 1930s, they did the same thing in the context of the Battle of Cable Street, which was one of the most successful anti-fascist actions of the 30s. The fascists argued that the anti-fascists had infringed upon their free speech. But in other contexts where that language was not useful, you don't see Hitler in the 30s, before he took power, talking a lot in terms of free speech. It wasn't a vernacular that was as useful in the German context, and they didn't use it. All is to say, in the post-war period, fascists tried to take any kind of language or cultural image. They stole skinhead from anti-racist skinheads. They, in Europe, even tried to use black bloc tactics. They took some language from Maoists and Trotskyists, and it's a bizarre, confusing mess. But what it shows, though, is that it's evolving, and the ways that we resist it need to evolve as well. Doxing is an interesting example because it's in a certain sense is a very small group or individual activity. The people on the left or the right who actually do the research to find out who their opponents are and broadcast that information are relatively few in terms of the larger society. But it is a strategy and a tactics that relies on public opinion, because it's only effective to dox a Nazi if it's a problem for them to be a Nazi. And it's only disconcerting to be doxed as an anti-fascist if there's a potential that your employer may fire you for it, your university may expel you for it, and so forth. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to recognize that we have a role to play in, on the one hand, saying, if you think Hitler was right, that's a perspective we're not going to tolerate in our communities. And on the other hand, if you're devoting your time and energy to trying to make our communities safer, we have your back and we stand in solidarity with you. In my case, I was condemned by the president of my college, Philip Hanlon at Dartmouth College, for advocating quote-unquote violent protest, which was a gross oversimplification of my book. More than 130 of my coworkers and professors at Dartmouth signed a letter of support saying, we support his intellectual freedom, we support his research, we support what he's doing, and so then the president didn't fire me. If they hadn't done that, who knows? So that's a sort of very clear case in which at a certain point when you start talking about anti-fascist politics, you're also talking about labor politics, you're also talking about community politics, and really how we make communities that are strong and resistant to this kind of stuff. Again, though, you can never assess any political group or movement or history exclusively in terms of tactics without talking about why they do what they do, what it means, where it's coming from, where it's going. If you just talk about what people are doing without why, that's not history, that's not politics, that's at best like traffic reporting.
You stepped on my last question a little bit, but it's fine, I forgive you. I was just wondering that, I mean, you've become part of the story in kind of strange and sometimes unsettling ways. Your Amazon page was flooded with negative reviews after the book came out. You had this incident with your employer basically calling you out publicly. I was wondering, as reporters generally, you try to avoid being a part of the story, and you were thrust into this against your will.
Well, I'm not a journalist.
Yes, yes. You report.
Yes.
But I was wondering what that has been like for you, because it must be surreal in some ways.
Well, in the book and in my speaking about the book, I'm very clear that I don't aspire to be impartial. I don't think that we can actually be impartial about white supremacy and fascism, and people who genuinely aspire to be are worthy of skepticism at best. So that's one part of it. I was cognizant of the fact that the kinds of death threats that I did receive could come. But in speaking to people who actually do this work, who have been attacked, I spoke to one anti-fascist who's active in a group today who has had the far right drive up and down his street with shotguns to intimidate his family. I've spoken to people in Europe who have been seriously injured, who have had their comrades murdered. So I feel like I've only gotten a drop of any of that, and I try to see my role in this as facilitating the expression of their stories and experiences, because many of those that I interviewed for security concerns, for employment concerns, for one reason or another, are not in a position to share what they've been doing. So that's why the book is largely based on interviews. It's an effort to put these struggles into a conversation with a larger historical trajectory. I, as a historian, I do my historical work in order to facilitate the meaningful engagement of people making the world better today with the histories of how we've gotten here. And I'm happy that has happened to some extent with this book, but I'm not the story as much as journalists who are interested in human interest stories have tried to at times make me the story.
On that note, maybe we can facilitate some dialogue now. I think we're going to open up for a few questions if anyone has one.
And
yeah, there's a microphone.
Oh, me first. Okay, I thought it was over there. Okay, hopefully I'm summarizing your views correctly on this, but it sounds like you suggested that identifying a specific standard by which we determine who is fascist or who is deserving of anti-fascist tactics is like an impossible thing to do in a hard and fast way, and so the consequences of not having a hard and fast standard are somewhat negligible. You said like you can count a dozen people maybe who have been unfairly maligned or unfairly targeted, but do you not feel like that sort of mentality leads to just like mob violence, or essentially like similar things to where pro-Palestine activists get targeted or slandered as being anti-Semitic by Zionists, like things like that? If we don't have any sort of protection against that, like how can this tactic really grow?
it's a good question. So my argument is not that we shouldn't attempt to establish standards for what is a fascist, what is a white supremacist, what is racist, what is sexist, what is transphobic or homophobic. We should be doing that. We are doing that. We will continue to do that. The contestation over those values is ongoing and eternal. In that way, I think we can have reasonable and intelligent and compelling conversations and arguments as to what those standards should be, how they apply to different individuals, and who falls under what category. But to think that we'll ever get to a point where we all agree on those standards and where those standards become so non-controversial that the question of should someone like fill in the blank be invited to speak at our campus, the notion that we will ever get to that level of unanimity, the notion that we will ever get to that level of unanimity, and related to that, the notion that we should wait until we get to that level of unanimity before we engage in direct action to stop the spread of white supremacy seems to be missing the sort of lived human experience of having messy, contested politics. we look back on all sorts of movements in history and retrospectively see them as neat and clean. The good guys and the bad guys, the winners and the losers. It's never that neat, it's never that clean. We shouldn't expect it of our history, and we shouldn't expect it of our present day struggle. So what I'm trying to argue is not, I see where you're going with this, but the reality is there can be sort of a way of conceiving of politics where if you don't meet this abstract standard, you might as well not act. The question of will this result in mob violence? Well, these kinds of politics and notions have been put into practice by anti-racist, anti-fascist groups, direct action groups, left movements in dozens of countries for several decades. There may be moments and times and places where a critic might accuse quote-unquote mob rule of occurring, but at a larger scale, it just hasn't panned out. So I think that concerns of it are at the least overstated.
Really glad you're here. What is the role, or can you speak a little bit on corporatism, corporate state, inverted totalitarianism, manufacturing consent, and how we understand those ideas often better than we can talk about those ideas better than we can even define fascism, and how maybe a new way of talking about fascism is to start not calling it fascism anymore. Do we need a better word?
Sure. Yeah. So the fascist notion of corporatism, corporate politics is sometimes slightly misunderstood as to mean kind of like modern day multinational corporations running the government, but instead the way that Mussolini and his followers understood corporatism was as society being like a body, where instead of the parts of the body fighting each other, as happens in Bolshevism, where you have the working class and the ruling class fighting each other, in a corporate society, the head, which of course is in the fascist parlance is imagined as like the elites, and the hands, which are the workers, are all doing their jobs harmoniously going along with each other. And in that sense, class collaboration and a resistance to class conflict is inherent in fascism. Some quote unquote left fascists have attempted to push more of a workers' agenda into fascism, but when Hitler and Mussolini got into power, all those folks got killed. So that's sort of what corporatism has meant in fascist parlance, and that's why, to some extent, you can see elements of continuity with all sorts of right-wing politicians in different times and places who have argued that the interests of the nation ought to be put ahead of the interests of a specific class. There is continuity there, and there is a concern that if we don't have strong union movements and strong workers' movements, that our ability to really promote our own interests could fall in this direction. For me, it's important to understand what fascism is, but to understand that things could get pretty awful without it being a textbook case of fascism. So I think that the question of do we have fascism, is fascism growing, is part of the conversation but shouldn't be the whole conversation, and that ultimately, if we have something that's much worse than what we have now, it probably won't look the same as what Mussolini or Hitler had in mind, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about things getting worse, but that history, despite the adage, does not actually repeat itself. And we should be looking for ways that the far right changes, the ways that authoritarianism can manifest itself differently. In the book, I have a section 5 lessons for history for anti-fascists, and one of them is that to some extent I think the European left of the 20s and 30s was slow to realize the real danger that fascism posed, because it assumed that it was simply another variation of traditional right-wing politics. So the takeaway from that for me is we should always look at how far-right politics change and how maybe our resistance should change with it, and how maybe at a certain point the framework of fascism may no longer be helpful. I don't think we're there yet. I think there is enough continuity and comparison between some of these far-right groups and the kind of world they're trying to build to see that connection, but we should be open to the notion that it may become counterproductive or anachronistic. Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking the word fascist. The word fascist doesn't resonate among Americans. A lot of people don't even see the Ku Klux Klan as being Nazis, unless they actually put on a swastika or something. And you know, one of the big things about fascism is divide and conquer, racial divide and conquer. Our racial divide and conquer started in Virginia before the Revolution, when there was a major revolt by the indentured servants and the slaves. That's when they decided, well, we need racism. What's my question? Aren't we limiting ourselves sometimes when we just talk about fascism?
Yes.
Because we have a rich history. The other guys talk about regulations. We need to talk about the triangle fire and why we have regulations. And I just don't want to see ourselves cut off from what is a very rich history of resistance that includes labor unions, because what you're doing is unique in some ways and is very good. But the right wing always pulls up history, and our people don't seem to know enough history. And that's about the size of it.
Yeah, you're right. The story is much bigger than fascism and anti-fascism. And I tried to sort of briefly touch upon that earlier, but the history of white supremacy, imperialism, genocide go much deeper, are much broader. The ways to resist it. So when I have events where the conversation really gets good, what we start to do is what you point to, which is how does this connect to labor organizing? How does this connect to work against police, against prisons, against gentrification? To what extent is the far right, how are they connected to the Koch brothers, to Wall Street, to the White House? If we talk about climate change and how that has a very racialized impact as far as who is feeling the brunt of it around the world, you can't just talk about one part of any of this. It's all related. And so certainly you're right to say that it's not just about fascism and anti-fascism. We need to, and that's also partly why anti-fascists don't only organize against textbook fascists. I've had some people say, well, such and such a fascist is Jewish, so end of story. Well, there were Jewish fascists in Italy, but even if there weren't, fascism changes what the far right changes how it looks. So yes, I think that's an important point to always make. Thank you.
Okay. So there's been a lot of talk about just like how to define fascism, what it is, and I just feel like it's put up as this boogeyman in history, especially within like how like liberal centrist historians kind of like frame history that way. It's like it's the ultimate evil, and I don't really see that being the case in terms of just like historical institutional violence that go through history, and like to what extent you have like certain infiltrations of like white supremacy into like left-wing movements. So how do authoritarian left, how do tankies factor into like this aspect of like this red-brown thing we see in terms of like alliance, like a pro-Putin crowd in terms of being anti-imperialist, or like having like Bolshevik parties support Assad as well as having Matthew Heimbach support Assad, and just like how do you see that factor, and what role does that play in terms of like anti-fascists and how they frame these certain things?
Right. So, I mean, the question of, well, not all authoritarianism is necessarily fascist. If you look at Stalin's Soviet Union, was authoritarian and repressive and not fascist. In terms of what you're pointing today, writers like Alexander Reed Ross and others have written about a kind of modern-day red-brown alliance and ways in which certain odd self-described communist factions have worked alongside different fascist groups, sometimes with sort of Moscow as this bizarre kind of overlapping nexus. Yeah, I mean, that stuff is pretty bizarre. I don't focus on it because it's not something that necessarily directly connects with the sort of what people need to know walking away around the issue. But I do think we can't simply only be critical of fascists or not have a kind of broader emancipatory politics that looks at the ways in which authoritarianism can manifest in other times and places without necessarily being the same as fascism. So I'm also critical of other kinds of authoritarianism. Yeah, you want to follow up? Yeah.
Most Antifa would identify as like anarchist or like.
In the U.S., I'd say that's probably true, but there are other contexts when a lot of anti-fascists are different kinds of Marxists. So it depends. Yeah. And of course, given the legacy of like the Spanish Civil War and other places where the left have had not a cooperative role with each other, it's not something that always is an easy, smooth walk in the park. Yeah.
I recently watched the TV show Babylon Berlin, which is about the experience of life in Weimar, Germany, in the late 20s, and things are kind of starting to come apart at the seams. And one thing they depicted that I thought was very interesting was the growing prevalence of the stab in the back myth, right? The idea that the nation doesn't lose a war, or the military doesn't lose a war, that basically social democrats in that context, was code word for Jews, really are the reason why a nation experiences humiliation. And you saw that in Reagan's rise to power, you saw that with the Klan's rise to power in the South. So I'm curious to see if you think there's any use in folks developing a response to that, and if so, what that might look like.
Great question. Yes, so the stab in the back myth was central to Nazi propaganda. It wasn't a myth that they came up with. It predated them, basically right after World War I ended. The German far right, which was pretty robust before the Nazi Party was a thing, looked at the end of World War I when the war did not end with the occupation of Berlin. It ended when politicians signed an armistice with the Allies. And so that was interpreted really incorrectly as a stab in the back by the different enemies of the true German people, whether that be Social Democrats, whether that be Jews, whether it be whoever, and was capitalized upon in that way. And considering the role of the Versailles Treaty in putting Germany in a tough economic position and as a kind of unifying national myth, it was super important. I think today, or really any kind of situation where the far right rises, you need two things, right? You need an us and a them. The us is pretty much imagined in nationalistic and or racial lines, and that you see a sort of implicit other in terms of immigrants, Muslims, Jews, fill in the blank. And in that way, the argument fits together. We have this problem because of these people. The solution is to exclude them or limit their influence or murder them or what have you. And that's why you can't simply talk about this in terms of self-described fascists or self-described Nazis, but how anti-immigrant sentiment is dangerous on its own and creates a platform for these groups. Because these groups pretty much always start small. Sometimes they grow big, but they grow big not by converting people to their ideology, but by capitalizing upon sentiments that are already widely shared, like these xenophobic, racist, Islamophobic perspectives. And so in that way, you can make an argument, and I think it makes sense to think of immigrant solidarity work as anti-fascism, for example. So that connection is central to what we're talking about.
This will be one last question.
So I'm about halfway through the book. It's really great. I'm enjoying it.
Thanks.
The part that I was really inspired by, that I was reading yesterday, was the section where you were talking about or writing about the Rock Against Racism and the unification of the punk movement and reggae artists. Mm-hmm. And I really found it interesting, both for myself as a person who works in the cultural sector, and how cultural workers and artists can join with and collectively work with different movements. And I was curious about what you're seeing right now in terms of allegiances between artists and organizers and how that is operating. And also, I'm trying to think of a good way to frame this question, but I can't, so I'm just gonna say it in the bad way, which is, I'm oftentimes very conflicted as an artist because I don't feel like making art is enough for a movement. Am I doing my part by adding my contribution of, I'll just make this great piece of art and that will solve the world, does that question happen outside of like artists, or is that purely our like innate need to pick our own brains?
Yeah, I mean, it's not for me to say what is enough for you or anyone else to do. But as a movement, no one form of resistance is enough. I think you can say that broadly speaking. Art, though, is essential to resistance. It is essential to anti-fascism for a variety of reasons, but one of the most obvious is people in general want to feel a sense of belonging. They want to feel a sense of purpose and meaning, and that is often communicated and provoked through aesthetics. And so in the context of Rock Against Racism, the success of this concert series in Britain, but also there were Rock Against Racism in Canada, in the US, and elsewhere, where the slogan was NF. NF stood for the National Front, which was the fascist group in Britain at the time. NF equals no fun. Sounds very like one-dimensional and simplistic, but if you can make it not cool to be a bonehead, that has huge implications for young people who are looking for a sense of meaning and belonging. And so journalists have often asked me, like, okay, you've mentioned this anti-racist action thing in the 90s, like, what did they accomplish? Creating this youth movement, going into high schools, talking to young people about how it's not cool to be a white supremacist, but it is cool to come on tour with us at Warped Tour, or to organize anti-racist punk shows, or to organize to boycott venues where neo-Nazi bands are playing, that inoculated a lot of young people, often in rural areas, often in cultural or local scenes where there was an active contestation going on between racist and anti-racist punk scenes fighting over the same people, that the legacy of pushing some people in the right direction is hugely important, even if it doesn't necessarily make headlines. And I mean, if you look at the historical fascist movements, aesthetics were a huge deal for them. And contestations over what was, degenerate art or German art or Italian art or futurist art were really central in a way that today I think is still true, but through different medium and different contexts and different conversation. But what we're getting at is that it takes all forms of resistance and organizing, and ultimately means building communities and societies where anti-fascism no longer is necessary because it becomes common sense. And that needs to have an aesthetic, it needs to have a cultural component. It can't just be about organizing or meetings. Well, really, resistance in general can't. And when we've been part of movements that have been reduced just to meetings, we feel what that's like. So, thanks.
Thank you. I have one thing to tell you and one thing to ask you. Mark has very graciously agreed to sign books, so we're going to push this podium aside and we're going to form a line here that will go up to the table. We have books at our store, so please buy one. And I also wanted to ask you, you have surveys on your chairs, and we are in the process, or about to begin a process of doing a strategic plan. This will be very helpful to us to understand who's coming to the Historical Society, and so we can figure out how we can serve the public better. So thank you, Mark, who's just left the room for quickly. Alex, thank you
He'll be
on
right
behalf
back.
of Mark. It was a wonderful
I will not sign your
conversation, and
books,
thank
though.
you all for coming.